Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks to all of you for having me, and for Judy and Greg for arranging this. Really excited to be here to meet you guys and to be in this tremendous club. I'm so honored to be to be among the few that have preceded me, I suppose, or many that have preceded me. So it's really exciting to be here. Um, as Greg mentioned, what I do, and for those of you that, well, let me ask: has anybody seen my work before at art festivals or any place around? Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, great. So you may have seen one of my pieces here, and essentially, as Greg mentioned, what I call this is rephotography, or my brand is time after time historical rephotography. And essentially, I start with old historical photographs from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I blend them with photographs that I take from the exact same spot, 100, 120 years later. And, for me, part of the fun has always been the hunt of finding these old photographs. And then, finding that spot where 120 years ago, a photographer stood on that very same spot and took that very same picture. And, and I've learned about some of the history of early American photography and know the history of some of these famous photographers, famous to some of us that study that stuff. And it's just really exciting for me to find that spot. And I have that eureka moment that, I get when I say, oh, wow, there is this shot. And it's very exciting. But, it all started about 6 years ago, when I came across this old photograph. Some of you may have seen this. This photograph's been around a bit. You can see down on the little inscription down on the lower left side, it says Shore Drive, Lincoln Park, with a copyright date of 1905. And I thought it would be kind of fun, as a lot of people do, I think, to go out and reshoot that picture from the same vantage point. And that's what I did. And I looked at them side by side, and I thought, well, that's kind of neat. And there are books that have been published. I think Chicago Then and Now is one you've probably seen, or Lost Chicago, where they do these side-by-side comparisons of Chicago. But I wasn't content with that. I thought, well, what if I could take it a step further and blend the two together? And so this is the first one I ever did. And so that became that. And of course, you've got, with the old photo, you've got nothing like that, right? There's no skyline. There's not a whole lot that is there today. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. At least I thought so. Anyway. And so, I thought, well, I got to do more of this stuff. And so I did a few more. And this was one of the next ones that I did. And this is a shot of State Street south of Lake Street in 1900. And I was intrigued by that for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the incredible scene of State Street back then, with the Theatorium on the right, and I believe the Masonic Temple there on the left. Those of you probably know much more about the Masonic Temple than I do, but I know at one time for many years, it was the tallest building in Chicago. But I was also curious as to how the photographer got that picture, because it looks like it's elevated. Well, sure enough, it's because he was standing on the State Lake overpass of the L. And so I went up to the State Lake overpass, and just to show you how, detailed I am about this stuff, I got to the top of the platform, and it just didn't look right. The angle wasn't right. So I took one step down on the staircase leading up to the platform, and that wasn't quite right either. So I took one more step down, and that was the right angle. And so I took my shot from the second step down from the platform of the State Lake overpass and created this. So now, of course, it's a very different scene, right? And to me, it was important to capture some of what the exciting parts of the old image were, namely some of the great buildings on the right, blended with, of course, the new scene with the Chicago Theater marquee, which I think, for all intents and purposes, has almost become the unofficial logo of Chicago, right? I mean, that theater is known the world over. So that picture has just sort of become one of my most popular pieces, and I'm Still to this day, I think it's just a fun image to look at, and sort of look at how I've sort of weaved the old and the new and the street scene and whatnot. So really proud of that image and all of that, all the history that it really shows. By the way, jump in anytime. If you guys have any questions or want to say something good, bad, or ugly, just let me know, and I'll be happy to take any questions as we go along. So then, so as I've been doing this, this was one I just had to do, right? I mean, I've been looking for a picture of George Streeter for the longest time, and you know, I guess there are many stories of Cap Streeter and you know how he beached his ship, the Rutan, where he did it, and all of the legends behind him, some of which are true, some of which I don't know they're true. But what I believe is true is that at some point when he was forcibly removed from the spot he had occupied at what is now, I think, where the John Hancock building is, when the Michigan shoreline came up that far, he was exiled to a spot which is now the Ogden Slip at the entrance to Navy Pier. And what I thought was so interesting about this picture is, you know, of course, they would eventually name this neighborhood after him, and Streeterville, of course, is famously named after George Streeter. But if he were beached on that spot right now today, he would be overlooking some of the most incredible real estate in Chicago. And so I had to get a Cap Streeter picture, and I also had to get a St. Regis picture in there, and I was able to get this one. In fact, just earlier this year, this is one of my most recent pieces, and I think it really does tell such a great story of you know, from the early days of George Streeter to the modern, you know, the modern architecture of today. So another piece that I really loved was this one here. And there's a lot going on in this picture, and I became curious about the Goodrich docks, the Goodrich Company, the ship, the Columbus. Anybody familiar with the boat, the Columbus? Nor had I, but I was intrigued. So I did a little research and found out that the Goodrich Company was one of a number of ferry companies that operated on the south bank of the Chicago River in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And one of them was the Goodrich Company. And in 1893, they launched a ship called the Columbus, the Christopher Columbus. And it was put into service to take passengers from the river to the 1893 Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago World's Fair, hence the name the Christopher Columbus. And so she was put into service in 1893 and was finally decommissioned in 1934. But only after, in 1933, she also took passengers from the docks to the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair, making the Columbus the only attraction that appeared at both the 1893 and the 1933 World's Fair. And over the time of her service, she carried almost 2 million people around the Great Lakes, because she was put into ferry service and you could go to Milwaukee for $1 and all around. And to this day, no ship has ever never carried as many passengers as the Columbus did during her time. But I became a little more curious about the Goodrich Company and found out that the founder of the company and owner, Albert Goodrich, who I believe was a distant relative of the B.F. Goodrich Tire Company founder. So Albert Goodrich had this shipping company, and inexplicably, he became the fire commissioner of Chicago in 1927. And because of his background in the maritime business, you know, those of you that are boaters know that all ships have red and green lights on the ships to indicate port and starboard. So for some unknown reason, when he became fire commissioner, he installed red and green lights on the side of every Chicago fire station. And if you look at any Chicago firehouse today, you will see there are red and green lights indicating port and starboard on the firehouses because of what Albert Goodrich started in 1927. So, you know, that's just a piece of Chicago history that everybody needs to know about, because it's just clearly something we all need to know about. But the interesting thing is, if you look at this scene today, if you're standing on the south side of the Chicago River and you're looking at where the Goodrich docks were, which were basically at Rush Street, this is what the scene would look like today. So, and again, another one of my favorite pieces, only because obviously right here in this picture you got, you know, three of the most iconic buildings in Chicago: the Wrigley Building, the Tribune Building, and the Medina Temple. Now the what is it? The Intercontinental Hotel, I believe. Right. So again, I just thought that the combination of the story here and what that scene looks like today made for a, you know, one of my favorite pieces in my collection. Okay, so one of my most recent pieces, and I think one that has probably my favorite story of all of the pieces I've done, is this one here. And this is a scene from Randolph Street. We're looking east from Dearborn, as you can see, towards State. There's Marshall Fields there. There's a photo taken in 1914. And it struck me, I mean, look, the architecture, right? I mean, it's just classic old Chicago architecture. I like the signs, the cigar sign, the dentist sign, and whatnot. But when I went out to shoot that picture today, obviously all of this now has been replaced by Block 37, and the scene looks something like this. But I wanted to keep a lot of the old architecture because I thought that was such a fundamental part of the scene. But what intrigued me more than anything was the white billboard on the lower right side of the picture there on what is, you can see, the Cunard building. Now the Cunard company, you know, is a famous passenger ship company. They had the QE2, the Queen Mary, obviously very famous shipping company. Anchor Line was one of their competitors. They eventually merged, but Cunard was the company that survived. And this was their Chicago sales office at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn. And in 1914, when this picture was taken, they were promoting the voyages out of New York of their three biggest ships: the Aquitania, the Lusitania, and the Mauretania. So in 1912, 2 years before this picture was taken, the Mauretania was one of two ships that had gotten word that the Titanic had struck an iceberg. And she and her sister ship, the Carpathia, were dispatched to try to rescue passengers. The chairman of the Cunard line was on the Mauretania at the time. Unfortunately, the Carpathia got there first, was able to rescue however many passengers they could rescue that were in the ocean, but by the time Mauretania got there, it was too late. There were no passengers left to survive. So the chairman held a seaside vigil on the Mauretania in honor of, in memory of the victims. Well, then, of course, famously, a year after this picture was taken in 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a torpedo fired from a German U-boat, which precipitated the U.S. entry into World War I. And then 3 years later, in 1918, the Carpathia, that had rescued the passengers from the Titanic, was also struck by a German U-boat and sunk, making it one of the last casualties of World War I before the war ended later that year in 1918. And so in this one random picture of Chicago in 1914 is the story of some of the greatest maritime history in American and really world history. And it's just so ironic and iconic that you're seeing a picture that was featured here in our city. But the story doesn't really end there, because as it turns out, there were survivors of the Lusitania. And there were passengers from Chicago on the Lusitania. In fact, one couple, sadly, who did not survive, was Charles Ambrose Plamondin. Anybody hear of the Plamondins? So Charles and Mary Plamondin were celebrating their 36th wedding anniversary. He was a sort of a famous industrialist. He had a tool and die company here in Chicago. And he and his wife were on the Lusitania when it sunk, and sadly they did not survive. But his cousin, Edwin, I believe, had better luck, because 3 months after the Lusitania went down, the Eastland capsized in the Chicago River, and his nephew survived the sinking or the capsizing of the Eastland. And if that isn't crazy enough, 12 years before the Eastland disaster came the Iroquois Theater fire here in Chicago, I believe in 1902, 1903, maybe 1902. And Charles Plamondon's daughter, Emily, was in the Iroquois Theater when it caught fire and burned to the ground, and she survived that. Of course, it is to this day, is the largest single loss of life of any fire in American history. But the Plamondens survived two big disasters, did not survive one. But I mean, again, just just with this one sign on this photo, it has so many stories, and it's the stuff that, I mean, I just love most about what I do is, yeah, blending together the pictures is great, but learning some of the stories behind what's going on is to me, gives me such a great thrill. Okay, so my newest piece, this one I just completed 3 weeks ago. Now, this is a very famous picture. You've probably seen this picture. I think it's in the Chicago History Museum. It's actually one of many photos from the day that show this just nasty traffic jam that always occurred at the corner of River Street and the Rush Street Bridge. Now, of course, River Street is no longer there. It's became Wacker Drive. In fact, I believe it was Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago that called for the elimination of River Street and Water Street, which is right behind it, and forming Wacker Drive, a bi-level roadway. And because of the bridge and how close it was to the intersection there, they replaced that with the Michigan Avenue Bridge in 1920. So those are, I'm sorry, did you have a, oh, sorry. So neither Rush Street Bridge or River Street exists today, but you guys know where that scene is. And that building on the right is now the location of the London Guarantee Building, I believe, at the corner of Michigan and Wacker. So, so I had this picture for a while. It's one I'd been wanting to do. So 3 weeks ago, I went out with my assistant, and I noticed that the picture was sort of taken from an elevation, right? It looks like you're getting kind of a downward-looking view of the scene. So I went out with a tall ladder, had my assistant holding the ladder, and I was all ready to snap this picture. Well, it was the Thursday before the Air and Water Show was appearing that weekend. And the Blue Angels were flying all around. And I thought, what if I could get lucky? And they were flying up and down and all around, and then they went from south to north. And as they went that way, I could see them making a big U-turn, and they were going to come back down towards the south. And I held my finger on the shutter, and I just waited, and I just went click, 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 and all of a sudden, so as just plain dumb luck and maybe a tiny bit of planning. So here you have a scene from 1915 blended together with, here's you've got a horse and carriage, and then a squadron of fighter jets flying through the picture. So this is probably the most dramatic example of of a blend in old and new that I've done. But as is the case, the story doesn't end there. So I was intrigued by, and here's the Goodrich line again. So here's the Goodrich docks. Now the price has gone up from the other shot from 1900 or 1905 when it cost $1 to do a round trip from Chicago to Milwaukee. Now it's $1.25, as you can see on the sign. But if you see down below to the left of that Goodrich boat sign, you'll see another little sign, because Goodrich obviously wasn't the only company that had passenger ferries on the Chicago River. One of them was the company that had the Eastland. And you can see the Eastland, there is the Eastland on the side of the river there. I'm a little bit puzzled because that was not where the Eastland went down. The Eastland went down, I think, more towards, a little bit further west, kind of where Reed Murdoch building is, somewhere around there, Dearborn. But there it is there. So either at some point it was moved or it was there temporarily. But this picture was taken in 1915. So the original photo is, oh, I said 1905. That's wrong. It's 1915. And, the Eastland went down July 24th of that year. So I'm guessing that this photo, and people are, the convertible tops are down. It must have been a fairly warm day. So I'm guessing that photo was taken very shortly before, July 24th, when the Eastland capsized, sometime shortly after that picture was taken. Okay, just a couple more here for you. So because we are I had to have a little architectural connection here with some architects I think some of you have heard of. So here's my connection to Daniel Burnham. So I came across a fantastic lithograph called The Dream City, and it was illustrated in 1893 by an illustrator who went up in a tethered hot air balloon, something like that you see up in the upper left. And he drew this incredible scene of the World's Fair in its place, in Jackson Park, with the nascent city of Chicago all full of smokestacks in the background. And in 2018, the 125th anniversary of the fair, I wanted to do something that would basically show what would the World's Fair look like if it was set in present-day Chicago. So I chartered a helicopter to take me up and try to find that angle where this illustrator illustrated this fantastic scene from. And using the Museum of Science and Industry as my reference point, because it's the only building that is still where it was in 1893, I took my photograph and blended them together to create. Okay, so there is my version of the Dream City, showing what the World's Fair would look like if it was set in present-day Chicago. So I was so smitten by the way this turned out that I created this as my only signed, numbered, and framed limited edition piece. I only did 50 of them. And at the first art show that I had exhibited this, that I was exhibiting this at, I had number 2 on the wall. I set aside number 1 for something different, but I had number 2 on the wall at my art show. And I'm standing there in my booth, and I'm sort of standing near the piece, kind of like this. And I can see this woman kind of with her eyes bugging out, and she just is like, from a distance, I could see she was looking at my piece, The Dream City, and she makes a beeline right over to me, and she said, "I'll take it." And it's a big frame piece on the wall. She didn't look at the price. It was a $2,500 framed piece. She said, "I'll take it." I said, "Oh, thank you so much. My name is Mark Hersch." And she said, "My name is Greta Burnham. I'm Daniel Burnham's great-great-granddaughter." So I picked myself up off the floor and took her order, took her credit card and all that. And she called me the next day and said, "I like it so much, I want to buy another one for my father, who's Daniel Burnham's great-grandson." So the Burnhams have number 2 and number 3. Obviously can't think of a greater honor than to have the Burnhams owning some of my artwork. And as an aside, did anybody know her, Greta Burnham? Anybody ever met her? What a delightful human being she is. I mean, she's lived in a number of countries. She speaks 5 languages. When I delivered the piece to her at her home, she has a beautiful home in Lincoln Park. So I go in, you would never know she's a Burnham. There was literally nothing in her house. There's nothing in her house that would scream that I'm a descendant of, well, there is now, there's something in her home but there was nothing. And she was just so delightful. She said, would you like to have a glass of wine? And I said, yeah, this is great, So I stayed with her. We spent a couple hours with her, and just such an incredible person. And it dawned on me that it's kind of a neat story to have, maybe the media would like to know that Greta Burnham has this piece. And she said, Mark, I'm a very private person. I don't like social media. I don't really, feel free to tell the story, but I don't want to be, involved in any media. So anyway, so that's the story of how I got to meet Greta Burnham, Daniel Burnham's great-great-granddaughter, who has one of my pieces of artwork. Okay, one last story before I go. You all may have seen this, another sort of famous lithograph. It was in the Chicago History Museum when they were doing that, and they may still have it, the Chicago Fire Exhibit. It shows a piece called The Destruction of Chicago by Fire, October 1871. It was illustrated by a kind of a well-known artist of the day, Thomas Kelly. He was a contemporary of Currier and Ives, the famous printmakers of the late 1800s. and he drew this, you know, obviously incredible scene of Chicago on fire, and you know, just an incredible piece. Again, I wanted to sort of tell the story of, you know, what would Chicago look like if the fire was burning today, but also how did the city rebuild itself after the fire? So, not using a helicopter this time, but using satellite imagery. I was able to get a photograph of Chicago from that same angle to create this piece and kind of show, wow, you know, look at how big was that fire, but also what emerged from, you know, from the fire. And obviously so much emerged. The lakefront, I mean, everything that we know about Chicago today is largely due to the fire. So I'm exhibiting this in one of my shows. Well, it was last year because 2021 was the 150th anniversary of the fire, and that's when I did this piece. And I'm exhibiting it at one of my shows, and a couple comes into my booth, and he's looking around. I mean, he's got his nose up to this piece. I mean, he is like looking at every pixel in this illustration and some other stuff in my tent. And his wife comes up and says, "Man, my husband really likes your work." I said, "Oh, that's great to hear." She said, "Yeah, he's an architect." I said, "Oh, that's cool." So then he comes over and said, "Really love your work." And I said, "That's great. Your wife tells me you're an architect." He said, "Yep." I said, "What firm do you work with?" And he said, "No, it's a small firm you've probably never heard of." And I said, "Well, you know, I'm kind of into architecture. I may have heard of the firm." He goes, "Well, it's a firm called Adrian Smith Gordon Gill." I said, "Really? What's your name?" He goes, "Adrian Smith." So Adrian Smith bought my piece, and I was you know, I had never met him. I had never known what he looked like, but you know, I felt kind of like a schmuck when I said, you work for that firm? What's your name?" "Adrian Smith." So anyway, I assume we're in good company here, and you all know who Adrian Smith is. But again, I think between having Greta Burnham have one of my pieces and Adrian Smith having one of my pieces, I think I've kind of run the gamut of Chicago architecture. So those are some of my stories. There's a lot more, but oh yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. So first of all, I mean, part of what enables me to do this is that you know, you can't just pull an image off the internet, right? There's just not enough resolution. So what I have to do is get high resolution scans of the original glass plates that they were shot on. You know, you've all seen pictures of photographers back in the day with basically a wooden box on a tripod and a blanket over his head, and hits the shutter with a puff of smoke, and that image is projected onto a piece of glass. And it's 8x10 usually, or 5x4, but most of the stuff I get is 8x10 negatives. And so they're so rich in detail that you can blow them up so big that you like literally the mustache hairs on the guys. But to your point, the format of those cameras is very different than the format of the digital camera that I'm using today. So it took some practice, and it took a little you know, understanding of, you know, some of the mechanics of photography to where I could get a digital camera matched up with the format of a large format camera. It just, you know, it just wouldn't work. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you know the focal lengths of those little cameras to do some mathematics?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. A little trial and error. I mean, I remember when I first started out, you know, I was like, you know, I have a zoom lens. Let's say it's 24 to 70. It doesn't make a difference. But, you know, I was trying all kinds of focal lengths. I mean, I have the printed out picture here. You know, I'm looking at it, and this, that, and the other thing. And then I'm like, you know, I'm going this way, that way. That, you know, hopefully I get one of these shots right. But I got to where I sort of know that somewhere in the 50 millimeter, for you photography geeks who know a 50 millimeter prime lens, 50 millimeters is just about the right focal length, depending on how far away I am from the subject, to get the exact match. And then with the little computer work, perspective control and different things, I can make it work. But it was, definitely a learning process. It was frustrating at times, but now I pretty much figured it out. I think there was another question in the back. Yeah.
I have another process question.
Yeah.
This one is software.
Okay.
And what you're using and a little bit about that process and how many hours per image for software.
Yeah, I mean, the question, those are the two questions I get more often. Well, the one question is, how many hours does it take to do this? And my first answer is typically, it depends on when you start the stopwatch, right? I mean, if it starts with the thousands of hours that I've spent, sourcing these images, finding the glass plates, getting the downloads, figuring out what I need to do, then going out and shooting and all the stuff that is required. But I think to your question, once I get the photos in my system, how long does it take? The short end, 8 hours or so. This one was probably the most complicated one, just because the tracks and everything and the way I cut it and all that. That was over 2 days, probably 16, 18 hours, but pretty much minimum of 8. Although I will say, I guess if you like what you do, I know it's funny because my wife and I will have dinner and I'll say I'm going to go work on a new piece, and I'll get to my computer and I'll start. Let's say it's 7 o'clock, and I'll be working away, and I'll look at the clock and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. I had no idea that like 7-8 hours have just gone by, and I'm down to the pixel level, doing this stuff. So I guess maybe I don't know how long it takes, because I sometimes have no idea how long I've been working on them. But I know it's probably a good 8 hours at least. So. Yeah, I'm so Lightroom, Photoshop. I've got some plug-in software. Interestingly, Photoshop has evolved even in the 4-6 years that I've been doing this, with some really great, really great tools, perspective control especially, and that. People say, wow, you must be a Photoshop expert. I like to say, I don't use 95% of what Photoshop can do. I mean, I'm an expert on 5%, but the rest of it, I don't even know how to use. So, but yes, Photoshop and some other plugins and things like that. So, yeah.
Are you like archiving 2022, so somebody 110 years from now just
Yeah, so I was hoping that maybe in this group, or maybe you all know of an architect that is actually doing some planning right now, and we could do a three-way split of an old photograph. Like if I could have, met Jeannie Gang before she did St. Regis, and do like an old picture of Streeter, what it looked like a couple of years ago, and then what her diagram looked like, and kind of do a span of of past, present, and future, and that would be kind of a cool thing. But as of right now, I'm not sure how to make that happen. So, yeah.
I would imagine working with Photoshop at the pixel level, there are countless opportunities for oops.
Oh, yeah.
How often in your habit do you save what you've got so that you can go back?
Yeah, I suppose anybody that's ever worked, it doesn't matter what software. It could be Photoshop, it could be Word, it could be Excel. It doesn't matter. At some point, you've been working on something for hours, you never saved your work, and the thing crashes, and you're like, oh, geez. That's happened a time or two. And I've started over, and that is not a fun process. But I will say this, there are times when I go out and I just don't get it. I don't get the angle right. I don't get the perspective right. As hard as I try to make it work, I just didn't get it right. And I have a whole folder of files of unused PSD Photoshop files. It's because I didn't get it right. And so unless I can ever, figure out how to make them work, it doesn't always work. So, most of the time it does. Sometimes I just can't do it. Yeah, I guess that's a good question. It's hard to know. Usually the year that the year is always on there. A couple of images that I have the original inscription. I can think of one that says July 16th, 1909 or something. So occasionally there will be an indication of the month or the day specifically. But one of the things that I try to do, it looks like a spring day. I mean, just by the attire. I think the same thing in a lot of these, you're looking at people who don't have heavy coats on, although then everything was like heavy wool. I mean, just a walk down the lakefront with that kind of clothing on. So, but it's hard to know. But it does look like most of them were in fairly warm weather. How many do I have like in my queue? Oh, a lot. I mean, the other thing too is I've done in addition to Chicago, I've done this in 12 other cities. So I've got a whole collection of Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco, Washington, LA, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. I mean, I've kind of gone around the country to do this stuff. So I have a ton. In fact, my wife and I are going to England next week, and I've got some old Victorian London photos that I'm going to try to do. It's a little bit dicey because. And I don't need a lot. I just want the iconic London, the Big Ben across the river and Tower of London or Westminster Abbey or Parliament or something. So I've got all these old London pictures, but I've been using like Google Street View to try to see, do those angles still exist? And it's really hard to know if I'm going to be able to get that. If I can just get one, I just love to, my first international city, to be able to do a London piece, I think would be really cool. But other than that, I have a lot in the queue. Actually, yeah, the Chicago History Museum, Newberry Library, Harold Washington Library, of the local institutions, but more so, I mean, National Archives, Library of Congress, weirdly, the University of Southern California Library has a great collection of glass plates of cities all over the country. Same with the Yale University Library. So there's some university collections. I've worked with some local business. CTA has a great archival collection of some of their scenes with streetcars that I've worked with them to get some of their images. Metropolitan Water Reclamation District has some great old photographs of the early days of laying the sewers in the city and stuff like that, and they've got some great pictures. So it's just a plethora of. And by the way, if any of you guys have old photos, I'd love to know about them, because I actually have gotten a few images from people who have just seen me and said, I've got, my great grandfather had this old photo and I've got his stuff. And I've actually used a couple that have come to me from people who just had old negatives in their collection. So listen, my card is here. If anybody would like to get a hold of me or continue this conversation in any way, here's how you can reach me. It's also got my website on there. So if you want to see my other stuff, both in Chicago and anywhere else, feel free to take a look. But again, thank you guys so much. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Greg. Really appreciate it.